Welcome back to the second day of After the Archive. Glad you could make it to UEA in London, not the University of London. The running order is pasted in the reception, and basically we're going to. I'm going to just introduce Naomi Korn, and she's going to take us through some copyright challenges. We'll have a little break, and then we'll run through the workshops. You're more than likely aware of what, well, I hope you're aware of what workshops you're going to be doing today. If you need reminding, ask Steph. She's got some printouts of the schedule. I really hope you will enjoy those and use them in all their interactive potential. And then Matthew will be speaking in the afternoon, closing with his plenary. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Naomi Korn, who is a partner in the Naomi Korn copyright consultancy. I first met Naomi, or I attended a University of Sussex Research Hive seminar in the library at the University of Sussex, and I was really impressed by the way that she was able to convey the copyright challenges that one might have as a researcher in very clear and helpful language. She has over a decade's worth of experience in copyright issues. She's a lead consultant for JISC in the area of intellectual property rights. Started as the Tate's first copyright officer, is that correct? So has a wide variety of experience, and I'm sure you can join me in welcoming her to the After the Archive.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here this morning. Just going to load up my presentation. The copyright space is a very busy space, and there are lots and lots of ways of sort of giving people an overview of the issues. But my primary aim today, both through the presentation and also to the workshop, is to give you a general overview of kind of the space that copyright sits in right now. And then we're going to map the landscape. And then what we're going to do is we're going to start sort of nuancing into some of the issues that you're going to face in your understanding of working with archival material. Bear with me 1 second. Let me just pop this up for you. I'm a strong believer in helping to skill people up in terms of rights management and copyright by making you feel that you have a sort of power over the issues, because actually at heart copyright's quite a simple concept, and we'll look at that probably starting this morning but picking up again during the workshop after break. I'm also very passionate about rights management forming a basic element of digital literacy, because I believe that everyone really needs to understand what the key issues are and be able to apply them when they're dealing either with digitised material or born digital material. They are inherent, you can't get away from them. But I do believe that they're within everyone's control, at least to understand what the issues are and then to make rational, occasionally pragmatic decisions about the best way forward. So, I'm going to sort of give you an overview to start off with. I should add that a lot of the work that I've been doing right now has been in a new role that I have. I'm the chair of something called the Library and Archive Copyright Alliance, which is one of the foremost lobbying groups for librarians and archivists in the UK. So we represent basically all libraries and all archives, and we directly interface with policymakers in terms of new legislative provisions, and then many of which we're expecting to see next year. So the space is very, very busy. So in my presentation today, I will give you a heads up about the sorts of changes that you are likely to see, certainly from April next year, and then there'll be some others that we'll pick up in the workshop that will be kicking off in November of next year as well. Okay, so let's map the landscape. Let's see where we're at. Right, now let's see if I can do a switchy thing. Point it at the screen, right? Okay, so what I find really exciting is when I'm talking to people like yourselves, the majority of you would only have known studying using electronic resources. Certainly all the work that you're doing now, you are reliant on materials you find on the internet, journal articles that you're going to be supplied electronically through your library. You'll be doing so much of your research by a computer screen. And I have done all my studies, my BA and my MA. By the way, I'm an archaeologist by training, and that's where I've come from. I've actually come through a curatorial route into copyright, not from a legal route, so I'm very much a practitioner. So the world in which we operate, and this is really vital for us to understand in terms of mapping the legislative environment, mapping the technological space, is one where everything is electronic and it's cross-generational. We're using electronic resources in our studies. I did all my research using paper resources. So things have changed so much, so very quickly, and we need to remember that because that's highly relevant in terms of understanding the copyright laws. Looking at the way we use digital content and digital interfaces in our private lives and also in our professional lives is also important. I think it's incredible that my 5-year-old son and my 9-year-old son both use and are completely sufficient and able at navigating their way around an iPad. But also my parents as well, who are in their 70s. Now my mum is completely digitally, I would say, uninformed, but even she knows about emails. She tells my dad, she goes, "Oh look, Ellie, just Google it." Or just go on Skype. And she understands the concept of the technology and the interfacing. And so things have moved really, really quickly, and I think we need to remember this. And as a result of the speed of technological change, we have an explosion of resources. We have so much content that's both born digital, but also people want to put up on the internet, the digitized stuff. And this is, again, a lot of the space that I know that you're all working in right now. We expect to find things on the internet. I find it incredible still when I say to someone, well, you know, you can look on the internet, but actually most people don't have a digital footprint. Most people don't have any kind of presence about them on the internet. If you think about the percentage of the world's population, only a very, very small percentage of people have stuff about them on the internet, but we expect everything about everyone to be available on the internet. And the explosion of resources is in part because it's so easy now to create stuff. It's so easy to create images. This is a picture actually by my 9-year-old son, Daniel. I just find it intriguing. Whoops. I find it intriguing. This image here is slightly... Bless him. He does understand the birds and the bees. But, but everyone is a content creator, and it was basically what happened there, you know, the process. You know, this is a picture that he drew. I took a photograph, and then I could basically, if I wanted, I could make it available to the world on an anytime, anywhere basis. And that space is fascinating, how fast we can do things in an instance. But we are not all just creating content. We are able to publish it, and even more than that, through social media, through blogs, through whatever, we're able to grab other people's stuff and aggregate things as well. So the dynamic has changed in terms of our relationship with content. We don't just have to go through formal processes of a publisher to get things published. We are all doing it. And again, this has a massive impact on how copyright laws relate to the space in which we're working. This is why I'm starting at this point. We need to remember the general space we're in. It's also a very nice way to start a copyright talk on a Saturday morning, let's be honest. So, this is where we start to get kind of, I suppose, more serious and more focused in on the topic of the talk today, which is that the speed of technological change is super, super fast, okay? And we need to keep remembering this, okay? And it's represented by that green arrow. This is a complete oversimplification, but I really need to kind of ram home the space and the issues that we are all faced with in terms of copyright. And in comparison to the speed of technological change, the red arrow there represents the speed of legislative change. Okay, that's where copyright law sits. So basically, what does that mean? It means that there is a discrepancy and an inconsistency and incompatibility between what we want to do, what people expect from us, okay, represented by the green arrow, and the red arrow represents what we are allowed to do. And in that space, that's often where we find ourselves. And that actually is going to be what we're going to be talking about in the workshop after coffee break. And in that space sits, I would say, risk management. Okay, and actually, many of us feel that rights management means risk management because of that very indiscrepancy between what we want and what we're allowed to do. Does anyone know, in this room, how old copyright laws are? Because I think that's kind of important to remind ourselves about that. Any ideas?
Well, music still refers to phonograph, so that's got to be like 1910s.
1910. So you're saying we've got about 100 years? We've got 300 years? Good, okay. And what would...
Is it 1830s?
Okay, well, we actually have it nailed within the first few seconds. Well done, Ruth. 300 years. I mean, you're all doing well because you're saying at least 100 years old. So in fact, okay, so you're all in part correct because actually the laws that we're relating to right now, that form part of our legislative framework right now, are over 100 years old. We are all still reliant on the provisions of the 1911 Copyright Act. And that is mainly because copyright lasts for so long. It lasts often for the lifetime of somebody plus 70 years. So yes, absolutely, we're still looking back, and in fact our legislation is consolidated between various acts. We have the 1988 Copyright Act, the 1956 and the 1911, which are our key three acts, but we have other pieces of legislative reform that fall in between as well. We even have something that was passed as late as April of this year. It received its royal assent. There are copyright provisions in something called the the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act, ERRA, 2013. Okay, so we do have, but these are the three main pieces of legislation. So going back to Ruth's correct answer, you were saying about 1720 something.
Yeah.
Yeah, really good. Okay, good. Very good indeed. Well done.
No,
it's fantastic. 1709, done really well. Okay, it's the Statute of St Anne, okay, which means that actually copyright laws, the inherent principles of copyright laws in the UK are just over 300 years old. If you're interested in following a blog update about the developments in copyright laws that we're going to be seeing and debates about case law, there is actually something called the 1709 blog. Okay? It's a really, really good way of keeping updated. 1709 blog. Okay, and you know now why it's called the 1709 blog. Good, well done. So over 300 years, and that's a challenge that we have, which is that we are trying to apply principles, key principles that were developed hundreds of years ago that have changed very little. And that also is in part because most countries in the world have signed something called the Berne Convention, which goes back to the 1880s, and this established basic principles of copyright requirements as a requirement, a key requirement for trade. If you wanted to trade, you need to have basic copyright laws in place. So most countries signed the Berne Convention, then implemented those within their national legislations. And that's fine, so the copyright principles have pretty much stayed the same, but the technology, the space in which we're changing, has changed so very, very, very much. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the developments in copyright laws since 1988, to give you a heads up, as I said, about changes we're likely to see. But first of all, let's look at some of the ramifications of the problems of the current legislation. Has anyone heard the term Orphan Works? Can I have a show of hands? You've heard of it, you know what they are. Okay, anyone who's got their hands up, does anyone feel comfortable to explain what they understand by Orphan Works?
A work where there's not, it doesn't belong to anyone in the sense that you can, well, I know it from translation that you could translate it because you don't have to, there's no rights to kind of buy, as it were, to translate it, I think.
That's pretty good, that's pretty good. It's a good start. Does anyone want to build on that? Thank you.
Well,
It's a
you
really good start.
can't attribute it to anyone because it's not identifiably
off somebody's shoulder.
Okay, a bit more than that. We're getting this idea of sort of anonymous, unattributable, sort of orphanized. A little bit more I'm looking for.
I thought
Yes.
it was if there's no estate or no company that held the rights anymore.
Ah, okay, so I'm going to amalgamate everything the three of you said together, because you kind of sort of almost got there to collectively, which is also another interesting thing, because we're also often creating works collectively as well. I'm off to Leicester next week to give a paper on a conference about user-generated content, because that's a whole different ballgame of issues. Who owns what? It's just, anyway. Orphan works is a sort of technical term that's used for works that are still in copyright, okay, but where the rights holders are either unknown or cannot be traced. Okay. Now there is a sort of little bit extra that the legislators like to add on to that, which is after due diligence, after reasonable searches have been carried out. So after reasonable searches, there is a sort of a whole body of works where you just don't have anyone to ask, so you have all sort of hit it collectively. So I carried out some research on behalf of Gisborne and Collections Trust, and this was in 2009. Okay, so it's 4 years ago. We carried out a mass survey of UK cultural heritage, education, health service, basically public sector organisations, to understand the scale and impact of orphan works in the UK. Because at that point, the legislators both in the UK and in Europe needed to be provided with evidence to say, look, this is a really big problem. We're expected to clear copyright for these works, but we haven't actually got anyone to ask. And this is something we're going to pick up on again after break. We're going to home in much more on orphan works. So the figure we came up with was 50 million that we extrapolated, and we found at that point that we understood there to be 50 million, over 50 million orphan works across the UK's public sector, which is a massive amount. But actually, now I would say that figure is quite small. I think the figure is much larger than that. One of the clients that I work with is Imperial War Museums. In the Imperial War Museums collections alone, so they've got loads of documentary photographs and sound recordings and text-based works, things like diaries and letters. We have estimated that there are over 4 million orphan works in the Imperial War Museums collections alone. So I think that is a mere drop in the ocean, but it gives you an idea of the problem. Now, orphan works are problematic, and again, to reiterate, they are in copyright. The expectation is, and the legal requirement is, that even though you can't trace the rights holders, you still have to clear copyright to use it legitimately. And this is fascinating, okay, because if you've got no one to ask, how do you go and get permission? And the point that was made over there, sorry, it was, your name was Matthew? No. Josh. Sorry. Josh's point, which is, it's just gone into my head, sorry, I thought I remembered your name, and that's thrown me, I shall come back to that. Josh's point about estates that go out of business, or companies that go out of business, is also really important as well, because again, copyright lasts for so long that it can run and run and run and run and run. So the problem with orphan works is that sometimes you have companies owning the copyright, but the companies no longer exist anymore. Or someone might have died intestate, someone might have died without a will, without any beneficiaries. So what happens then? I mean, there's a term for that, it's called bona vacantia, but it still is a problem. And as a result, we found, certainly in the cultural heritage sector, which has been digitising its holdings for many years now, that, as I said earlier, risk management becomes so important. It becomes a fundamental component of any fully functioning organisation. Okay? It means that staff have to be more savvy, have to be more aware. It means an organisation needs a position on the risk level that it's comfortable with. So copyright, as I said, is so crucial in terms of digital literacy, but then starts becoming a really big organisational issue, because actually it's about policy. It's about an organisation's policy on risk. It's about strategy, which is where do they want to go as an organisation, what are their strategic objectives, and then aligning that, or aligning the practical implementation of good rights management and risk management to where an organisation wants to go. So it's actually a very, very big issue. And there's an O missing, I've just seen it. It's fine, it's Saturday morning. And it becomes very confusing and very messy and untidy. Okay, because even those of us who read the laws kind of sometimes day in, day out to understand the nuances, it's difficult to navigate our way through the kind of nebulous nature of the laws that don't quite fit the space in which we're working. They don't take into account what we want to do, what we need to do, and what we're doing. Governments have tried to resolve this, over the last decade. And the way that they've tried is by having a number of consultations that have been open with regards to how far copyright laws fit the digital age. It's been mad. I can't tell you how much time I've spent on behalf of various clients responding to these consultations. And I think there have been at least 5 of them in the last decade. But we're talking about big consultations that go on and on and on. And so each consultation requires so many responses. And so what they've done is they've presented this kind of question. How far do copyright laws fit the digital age? And then we've all answered and said they don't. And in terms of teaching and learning and research, it's a great inhibitor in terms of kind of capturing, digitising, preserving our nation's cultural heritage. We can't move. Listen to us, hear the problem. Government after government has not done anything. However, and this is what I find really interesting, is that the Conservative Party, the incumbent government, is actually the government that has listened, which is really interesting because traditionally the Tory party has not necessarily been in favour of rights users. But anyway, there was a big review of copyright laws in 2011 called the Hargreaves Review of IP. Has anyone heard of that, Hargreaves? A few of you might have been tracking it. And this was about trying to understand, again, whether they were fit for purpose, but also to see how far the copyright laws that we have at the moment promote innovation and growth. Unsurprisingly, the answers that have come back strongly are that actually they don't. They haven't. They don't promote innovation and growth. That they are actually quite an obstacle. And so we're going to be looking at those in a moment. But in addition to the recommendations that have flown from the Hargreaves Review of IP, there have been some other developments. And this is what I want to talk us through, so you get an understanding of what's been happening on a big, big level in terms of changes to the law, and basically to see how far the laws have or haven't enabled the free flow of resources, because really that's what we've been trying to enable. Okay, so let's start with the bad news and then end on a high. I think is probably a good thing. The developments that we've seen over the last few years, which are completely contrary to any rational person's thinking, have made copyright laws more restrictive. The first of those came through in 2003, and basically what they did was they criminalised certain activities in the digital space. So did you know that if you come across a piece of web-based content, and in order to use it, you strip out either the rights management information, or if it's locked up within any technical protection measure, like a digital watermark or some kind of lock, if you take that off, that is now both a civil and a criminal offence. Okay, so that's one of the changes that we've seen. The second change is that despite, again, all logic, that copyright laws last for a very, very long time, and a major part of the reason why we have so many orphan works, because rights holders are living for so long and we lose track of them. Despite that, yesterday, copyright laws were extended in the UK. Yesterday. And who do we have to thank for that? Cliff Richard, thank you very much.
I'd be glad to explain that.
We do. We have to thank Cliff Richard. It was yesterday. So essentially, let me map this out. So I'm not going to stay in this. I can do this. So okay. So let me give you a kind of overview of where Cliff Richard sits, and then let's look at the extension. So this is Cliff Richard. Okay. And he's a singer, right? But he didn't write any of his music, and he didn't write any of the lyrics. Those were written by these people here. Right? So he's a performer. Then, so you've got a number of stakeholders in Cliff Richard's piece of music. So you've got him, you've got the writer of the music, the writer of the lyrics. And then what you also have at the very least, is you have a number of other performers here who play sort of the music and the backing singing, and then all of that will be recorded. Okay, so that's on the very minimum level. There'll be other rights, but I just want to focus on these. So, before yesterday, these two people did really well. Okay, if you write music or you write lyrics, you'll be given quite a long time for copyright protection, which will be your lifetime plus 70 years. But if you were a performer, or you made the recording, before yesterday, it was only 50 years from the date that was made. It's going to work. It's okay. We're working out 50 years. So.
He's a teacher.
How many brownie points am I going to give you? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's really kind. They're not going to stain, are they? It's either that or me having a red tongue. I probably would have tried a bit harder to try and get that one to work. Okay, so 50 years for everything else. So Cliff Richard is how old? 96 or something? But whatever, Living Doll and some of his older songs, his rights were due to expire because the copyright only lasted, or his performance rights only lasted for 50 years, right? In the actual recording, again, the rights were only for 50 years. So the people that have been lobbying the European Parliament hardest have been the performers and the people who made the recordings, which is why it's now been extended to 70 years. Now again, I personally think this is counterintuitive to the space in which we're working. In fact, copyright lasts for too long. But this is what's happened. So we have sort of a couple of measures that have, I believe, prevented the flow. Moreover, and what's incredibly frustrating for many of us, the copyright and related rights regulations of 2003 have come from a European directive. This European Directive of 2001, you were following me? Yeah. 2001 was all about trying to create a more harmonised copyright framework across Europe, and included within the original Directive of 2001 a number of new exceptions to copyright. And exceptions to copyright are trying to balance and redress users' rights on the one hand, these are what we call the exceptions, with the exclusive rights of rights holders, the people who have created the content. Okay, so these copyright-related rights regulations coming from the European Directive are all about trying, in each member state of Europe, trying to create a more level playing field with better exceptions, better uses of works in copyright that you can use, or you can use other people's copyright works without having to go and get permission, in recognition of the digital space that we're working in, and in recognition of the benefits of culture, education, etc., etc. Public interest, greater good purposes. Now the problem with the European Directive was that it built in it these new exceptions, but they were non-mandatory, which meant that each member state had the choice to implement them or not. And guess what? We didn't. We had all these brand new spanking exceptions, again, that many of us had worked really hard in terms of lobbying for, and the UK government chose not to implement them, which actually created more disharmony across Europe than before, because other countries have done, and we didn't. So these two provisions actually have meant that your tap's been switched off. But the flow of content and resources for the greater good have been restricted even further. Incredibly frustrating. But, okay, my dad really likes to say, end on a high, make everyone feel really good. Despite that, we have the Hargreaves Review of IP. Now, I have great hope that as a result of this review, we've got a number of recommendations which include a number of brand new exceptions to copyright. Okay, some of which will be a benefit to libraries and archives, some of which will be a benefit within a teaching and learning space. Okay, some of which will be a benefit to you in your own personal space. So you may be aware already that if you format shift something, you change the format, you copy something in order to change the format, it's currently an infringement. Okay, so there's a brand new provision in there that will allow that. some wonderful new provisions as well for data and text mining, which is really, really important. So there's a number of kind of really brand new spanking things in there, which we're hoping are going to be implemented by April of next year. We're hoping, okay? So that's kind of something that we see as being really positive. I think realistically, if we go back to our arrow, even if those are implemented, okay, all of them are implemented in April, it'll probably take us to about there.
Too small.
There. In terms of the compatibility of what you're allowed to do and what you expect. It's never going to be the full compatibility. We're always playing catch up. You think how long we've been working to get these new laws in. It's been at least a decade, 10, 15 years. So if you imagine, the government's not going to want to do anything else for a long time again, and things will change again. I also would argue that many of the exceptions, and I think I have got a slide for you that kind of goes through them in more detail. Here we go. Many of the exceptions are actually only legitimising what's happening already. You know, I was travelling on a bus with a companion, and I sort of had this eureka moment, and I turned around and said to her, but it's not going to make any real difference anyway. You know, we've all been getting really kind of excited about these new exceptions, but actually the reality is that so much of what we are permitted to do is because we bought licences to enable it to happen. Your universities are spending millions, collectively millions of pounds every year just facilitating photocopying and scanning, and millions on your electronic resources, providing you with access to electronic resources. Anyone who works in a library space will know exactly how much we're talking about. That's not covered by the exceptions to copyright. You are paying for it. And that for me, is complete travesty. Okay, it's another issue, but I would like to reference, and I'd like to just give you a diagrammatic of what we're talking about. And this is going to impact you. Who's doing research here? Who's publishing?
That's me.
Pretty much all of you, okay. So I want to just show you something, and so this is you. Right? Okay. And what's happening is, this is your wonderful article, yeah? And this is your publisher. So what's normally going to be happening is that when you write your article and before you get it published, you're going to be doing one of two things. You'll either be giving your copyright to the publisher, and we call that an assignment or transfer, or you'll be granting them a license. Yeah? And it'll normally be the flavour of an exclusive license, which means that only they can publish the version that they then amend and change. You might come with you might be able to negotiate a few nuances of that, but that's pretty much what's happening. Okay, the publishers are then sort of publishing your stuff. And because of the terms of the license, which you're giving to them, when your university comes along, and your university wants to be able to photocopy or scan these articles, these rights, in many cases, will mean that they have to pay for a license to scan, to photocopy, and have e-versions of that. Now, I know there's open access. It's, in my mind, it's just not going far enough. Okay, it's a start. We have open access repositories. But the primary business model still of the publishers is actually then charging your university. So effectively what's happening is, in many cases, your university will be paying for access to the articles produced by its own staff. So, going back to what we're seeing. These are some of the key changes that were in the Hargreaves Review of IP. I've mentioned format shifting. There's a brand new exception that we're likely to see in April for parody, pastiche and caricature. Okay, there is that exception or fair use provision in the US that would facilitate that, but in the UK we don't have anything like that yet, so that will put us on a slightly more even footing with the US. We've mentioned data and text mining. We've also got a potential brand new exception for preservation copying. And I've always thought that one's probably, out of all of them, the one that sounds great, but actually is one that's happening already. Because most cultural, in fact, all cultural heritage organisations that I work with are already making preservation copies of items in their collections, because it's their mission to look after the nation's cultural heritage, even though currently this is not permitted under the UK copyright laws. So it's a very interesting space of working. So I want to give you this sort of overview. So what are some of the prevailing issues? Well, whether it's in a university context or whether it's the publishers, we are being faced with the sort of challenge of what routes and what route are we gaining access to other people's stuff. I've spoken about the role of risk management, and it becomes absolutely crucial that we understand what is the nature of copyright and how do we apply risk management within a digital space. Huge issue of concern to academics and researchers is whose risk is it? So if you are deciding to publish and if you do break copyright laws, what's going to happen to you? And I hear that time and time again. I know an issue that's come up through some of the discussion groups is what happens in an international space. There are no international copyright laws. There are some key principles that we're signed up to, but the nuances are very much based on each nation's implementation of its own copyright laws. So how does that work? If there's an infringement on the web, who takes responsibility? Who has liability? Who owns what? So it's again not just a case of us being the single publishers. Often we're working collaboratively, and we're dealing or we're digitising material that has been created by more than one person. We have this concept of layers of rights. So who owns what rights? User-generated content, as I mentioned, is a massive problem. And finally, copyright does take time. And so it becomes a real issue in terms of how do we manage that within our workflows? How can we shortcut some of the issues? How can we be efficient in our rights management? It's about budgeting if we want to do things right. So that in my mind is kind of big issues. I want to just, before I take questions, I have until 11, is that right? Before I open this up for questions, I want to do some basic nuts and bolts of copyright. Okay? So, based on what we've done so far, let's take a little breather and then I'll get you to do some stuff. Based upon where we are so far, are there any questions about the sort of general landscape in which we're operating, some of the big challenges we have?